Saskatchewan. Start somewhere inside its borders, pick a direction, and you can drive for hours without ever leaving. A land as vast and varied as its rich history. It doesn't matter where you begin or where you end. It doesn't matter if you're moving or standing still. The place will come to you. It will whisper to you. It will tell you stories. It's a place full of stories. Stories of culture, stories of survival, stories of accomplishment, and stories of people. It will capture your imagination. It will become a part of you. It will move you. Left, right, and center. Two polarized opposites in the same political spectrum, except with a middle. In 1929, there was no middle in Saskatchewan. The influence of the Ku Klux Klan had polarized every city and town in the province. A Klan-backed conservative government ruled. Neighbor was pitted against neighbor. Communities stood like dominoes ready to topple into each other. The ghosts of Saskatchewan's past were in the middle, pushing those dominoes left, right, and center. Then along came something that took even the ghosts by surprise. Sometimes history is like a series of dominoes falling into one another, one event leading to the next, or several into one. And sometimes history is like an earthquake, which simultaneously knocks all the dominoes right over, and the ghosts are left with nothing to do but watch in disbelief.
In Saskatchewan, they like to identify the Great Depression with the coming of prolonged drought, and these were excessively dry years. In fact, the decade is notorious for drying winds, the dust storms.
Some called it the Dirty 30s. Others knew it only as hard times. But the whole world experienced an economic downturn after the American stock market crash of 1929. It came to be known as the Great Depression. For Saskatchewan, signs of a looming depression began in 1928, when international export markets for wheat started to disappear.
And because Saskatchewan was so heavily dependent on wheat, and the wheat economy fueled the provincial economy, when the price of wheat started to nosedive, it sent shockwaves throughout the entire provincial economy.
From 1933 to 1937, drought plagued the province, leading to a series of crop failures. Where yields had been nearly 27 bushels per acre, average yields in 1937 dropped to as little as 3 bushels per acre. By 1933, per capita income in Saskatchewan was $133 per year, the lowest in Canada. Provincial revenue fell 90%, and 2/3 of the people of Saskatchewan found themselves on relief.
Up until the Great Depression, people believed that they themselves were responsible for their well-being. But come the 1930s, people realized that they were not at fault, but the system was.
People from Saskatchewan, along with other Canadians, wrote desperate letters to the Prime Minister.
Dear Mr. Bennett, I suppose I'm silly to write this letter, but I haven't anyone else to write to. We are just one of many on relief and trying to keep our place without being starved out.
Faced with a growing number of homeless, unemployed men, the government created work camps in remote areas such as Northern Ontario and BC's interior. The men worked 6 days a week for as little as 20 cents a day. The perception of the role of government in public life underwent a distinct change.
And so the Depression accelerates this process to a modern Canada where we have an interventionist state, the government taking a greater role in our lives, and people looking to the government for answers and for solutions to our problems.
The Depression spawned a variety of political movements across the country, including social credit theories by Alberta Premier William Eberhardt, the democratic socialism of J.S. Woodsworth, the Union Nationale in Quebec, along with the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation in Saskatchewan. Despite measures by various governments across the globe, the Great Depression did not end until England, the United States, and Canada were forced to jumpstart industrial operations in order to build weapons for World War II.
People began to question traditional values responses to the role of government during the 1930s. World War II delays those changes. The changes don't come about until the 1950s and 1960s, but the Depression's important in fueling or bringing about these changes.
As a result of the industrial and economic activity required to fuel the Second World War, the Great Depression ended. However, the human cost of the war was staggering. 64 million soldiers and civilians died.
It is in the nature of dominoes to right themselves, with the help of a few leftover ghosts. Gone was the KKK from the Saskatchewan political landscape. Bigotry and religious difference tend to fall right off the wagon when you're left haunted by matters of survival. When falling dominoes whisper wisdom in their wake, when the neighbor you thought you disliked so well becomes the one you lean on when times are bad, you find yourself centered in a new spirit of cooperation.
Cooperative action has long been associated with Saskatchewan, and cooperatives play an important role in the everyday lives of Saskatchewan residents.
Farmers across the province became the greatest proponents of cooperatives in order to build the business of agriculture.
Farmers came to believe that through cooperative effort, they could eliminate the middleman and ensure better prices for the things they sold and lower prices for the things they had to buy. The Grain Growers Grain Company was founded by farmers in Saskatchewan and Manitoba in 1906 to sell farmers' wheat on the Winnipeg Grain Exchange. The Saskatchewan Cooperative Elevator Company was founded in 1911. It too sold wheat on behalf of its members and also built a network of elevators across Saskatchewan.
Cooperatives moved from farm to the city, agriculture to commerce.
In 1937, the Saskatchewan legislature passed a bill to permit the organization of credit unions for the first time. And within very short order, half a dozen credit unions were established in Regina and Saskatoon and Moose Jaw.
Cooperatives developed beyond the agriculture and finance sectors as everyday consumers found ways to stretch their money further by working together.
Another kind of cooperative that early appeared in Saskatchewan were consumers' cooperatives or retail cooperatives. One of the first and one of the most successful was established in Davidson, Saskatchewan in 1914. Federated Cooperatives Limited that operates retail stores across the three Prairie provinces. In some ways had its origins in Saskatchewan.
We have federated cooperatives, we have Cooperative Life, we have Cooperative Hail, we have Cooperative Trust, and all of these cooperatives that came on as a result of missionary work by the Saskatchewan Wheat Pool.
Saskatchewan people have worked together through many different cooperatives to build business, community, and ultimately contribute to the distinctive character of our province.
In the first couple of years of the wheat pool, he was on the road almost constantly talking to farmers and to businessmen and everybody else about the wheat pool and what it could do for them, what they could do for the economy of Saskatchewan.
Alexander James McPhail was born in 1883, and he became responsible for his family after both of his parents died.
Being the oldest son in the family, sort of had to take over the farm.
McPhail found that farming in Saskatchewan was no easy matter.
There were all kinds of problems with the railways and with the elevator companies, and farmers were very disturbed by all this.
McPhail joined the Saskatchewan Grain Growers Association and eventually became an important part of the organization.
He was with what they called the Ginger Group. They wanted to get more involved politically, so they campaigned to get Alec McPhail in as secretary of the Saskatchewan Grain Growers, and this sort of cleared the way for political action.
During World War I, the government had created the Wheat Board. Wheat prices soared to $2 per bushel. After the war, the Wheat Board was dissolved, but farmers wanted to establish a cooperative method of selling wheat.
They thought they should set up their own central marketing system that would handle their grain for them. McPhail was really pushing this because he was a real believer in cooperation at that time.
If they could sign up farmers who controlled at least half the wheat acreage, the pool would be able to have an influence on the price that Canadian wheat would fetch in international markets.
In 1923, the Saskatchewan Grain Growers Association met with the Canadian Farmers Union. They took on the daunting task of attempting to sign 50% of Saskatchewan's wheat acres to wheat pool contracts. On June 26th, more than a year later, the pool contracted 6.4 million acres of wheat, and the Saskatchewan Wheat Pool was born. With MacPhail as the wheat pool's first president, the organization grew to become a central part of the province's agricultural industry. In 1927, the pool handled more than 90 million bushels, more than any other grain operation in the world. The 1920s ended on a disastrous note. In 1929, the stock market crash triggered a worldwide economic catastrophe that caused wheat prices to plummet, leaving the pool teetering on the edge of financial ruin.
The prairie pools are rescued from bankruptcy by first the provincial governments and then by the federal government. The federal government of R.B. Bennett insists that the pools give up their marketing function and become just elevator companies.
Throughout the 1930s, the wheat pool strengthened ties to the community by sponsoring sports teams, opening the wheat pool library, purchasing the Western Producer, and advancing the notion of cooperative ventures.
Alec MacPhail was a great believer in cooperation, and one of the things he pushed was joint action by farmers.
MacPhail died unexpectedly in 1931, but the wheat pool's survival of the Great Depression gave it a reputation of indestructibility. From towering highs to the devastating lows of near collapse, the pool has been a vital part of Saskatchewan farming for more than 80 years.
The ghosts of wars past always speak the same sad language. In 1939, those who cooperated together also sacrificed together. Many families sent their sons and daughters off to World War II, but the war also came back to them in a very unexpected way.
It was a big thing for Saskatchewan, all those air training plants. They sprung up so quickly, it was the biggest event that ever hit Mossbank.
1 month after Canada declared war on Nazi Germany, the British Commonwealth Air Training Program was announced. The program saw soldiers from Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom come to schools across Canada for air crew training.
Usually pretty clear here, and that was another reason why they chose Western Canada.
In early 1940, construction started near Mossbank on No. 2 Bombing and Gunnery School. Shortly thereafter, training flights began over Old Wives Lake, and by October, the first class graduated.
The reason why they set it up here was because they needed a lake for the bombing targets, and also they needed the lake to fly over for the gunnery exercises.
At its peak, No. 2 Bombing and Gunnery School had as many as 2,200 people in training. In less than 5 years, the school graduated over 2,500 bomber crews and over 3,700 air gunners. The Mossbank School was part of the largest air training plan in history. 104,000 training personnel at 360 schools graduated 131,000 air crew personnel in less than 5 years. By spring of 1945, victory in Europe was inevitable, and on March 31st, the training program was no longer needed. Today, all that remains of the No. 2 Bombing and Gunnery School is a plaque and the memories of veterans who can still recall their preparations for war above Old Wives Lake near Mossbank.
Left. What's left when all the ghosts have run out of good ideas? What's left when all the wisdom has been siphoned off the dominoes passing by? What's left when someone whispers a thought into the ear of another? What's left when that thought catches on to the next domino passing by? For Saskatchewan, in 1944, an election was left.
We ran a good, clean government. I was there for 11 years, and it was a good, clean, honest government, and there's a great deal of satisfaction in being able to say that and know that it's true.
The Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, or CCF, was a democratic socialist party made up of men and women who had lost faith in the ideals of capitalism. In 1933, the CCF held its first convention in Regina, where the party adopted its platform, the Regina Manifesto.
The aim of the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation is the establishment in Canada of a democratic means of cooperative commonwealth in which the supplying of human needs and enrichment of human life and the highest possible living standards for all Canadians shall be the primary purpose of a society.
The Regina Manifesto, not surprisingly, called for a wide degree of public ownership. It called for public ownership of transportation, of telecommunications, of power, of the banks and insurance companies, of the distribution of milk and gasoline, for example. It called for a national labor code. It called for the introduction of a national unemployment insurance plan. And of course, it called for the adoption of hospital and medical and dental insurance plans like the Medicare that we now regard as one of the great accomplishments of our nation.
The CCF had initial political success, winning 7 seats in the House of Commons in 1935 and 8 seats in the following election.
By September 1943, according to the Gallup poll, the CCF was the most popular party in Canada. But that didn't translate into success at the polls. In fact, the only election the CCF won during the Second World War was in Saskatchewan, where in June 1944, Baptist minister turned politician Tommy Douglas led the CCF to power.
Unusual factors may have contributed to the success of the CCF in Saskatchewan.
I think a different set of circumstances and a different set of values in Saskatchewan, because we came through the toughest times. You know, in the Depression years, Saskatchewan, I think, suffered more, except for perhaps in the Maritimes, that we suffered more of the drought and all of the conditions that brought about a radical political thinking.
Saskatchewan benefited a great deal from its support for the fledgling party.
The CCF in the early stages, following 1944, lit up the province. The Saskatchewan Power Corporation strung, on average, a mile of transmission line for every farmer that was serviced, something that a private power company would never have done because it wasn't economic.
Although the CCF was prominent in Saskatchewan and held a significant number of seats in Parliament, the 1958 federal election radically altered their fortunes.
Indeed, the CCF was virtually wiped out in the 1958 federal election, the year of the Diefenbaker landslide, when the Progressive Conservatives won the most seats any party has ever won in Canadian history. The almost complete disappearance of the CCF caused Democratic Socialists to rethink the purpose that the CCF had been set up to accomplish.
Despite its brief existence, many Canadians still benefit from the ideals and programs implemented by the CCF.
We've had a profound influence. The Department of Health and the health programs have been universally adopted. And the same thing applies to a number of other social programs that have been very important to Canadian people.
In 1944, a moment was left to be realized. The government of Tommy Douglas would change the landscape of Canada and the world around him. For a moment, the ghosts stopped pushing over dominoes. They felt another earthquake coming. They felt the future changing before their eyes.
It's a story of a place called Mouseland. Mouseland was a place where all the little mice lived and played and were born and died. And they lived much as you and I do. And every time on election day, all the little mice used to go to the ballot box and they used to elect a government. A government made up of big, fat, black cats.
Tommy Douglas was as good a platform speaker as Canada produced in the 20th century. He had the issues which he believed in. He had the passion. And he had the techniques.
Tommy Douglas, the man voted greatest Canadian in 2004, was born October 20th, 1904 in Falkirk, Scotland. His family moved to Canada and settled in Winnipeg. As a boy, Douglas developed a bone infection in his leg that required surgery. His parents couldn't afford the procedure, and doctors recommended amputation.
There's a little story about his life, about how his leg was saved because of the fact that he got some charity in a hospital in Winnipeg. He said that should never happen to anyone else. We should make that a matter of right and not a matter of charity.
In 1930, Douglas became the minister of Calvary Baptist Church in Weyburn. Although his congregation struggled through the Depression years, Douglas was a force of encouragement.
He believed in doing things. He didn't just talk about them. Very much of a scrapper. He was a feisty sort of person. And he didn't back away from a challenge. In fact, you know, he was a boxer at one time, too.
In 1934, Douglas took his community activism to the political arena when he ran for the Farmer Labor Party in Saskatchewan. Douglas failed to capture the seat. The next year, Douglas ran as a CCF candidate in the federal election and won. He went on to serve as an MP representing the Weyburn riding for 9 years. In 1941, he was elected leader of the provincial CCF party. Douglas resigned his federal seat to lead the CCF in the 1944 provincial election. The party won a massive victory, taking 47 of 53 seats. Douglas became head of the first democratic socialist government in North America.
He had this capacity to take Saskatchewan, which was a bedraggled province in 1944. There had been a terrible drought and depression in the 1930s. Farms were lost, the soil was eroded, industries were closing down. People had lost heart. In relatively short time, he got people believing in Saskatchewan.
The CCF embarked on an ambitious program. More than 100 bills were passed during their first year in power. Douglas's government managed to reduce the provincial debt by $20 million.
The first thing that he did in 1944 was that he provided treatment for cancer patients. And from there then he provided for free medical care for old age pensioners. And then he went on with improvements to the mental health care system in Saskatchewan, which was in terrible shape at the time.
The CCF created the Department of Cooperatives, the Department of Labor, and the Department of Social Welfare. To pay for the changes, the CCF cabinet took a 28% pay cut.
Douglas government never claimed to be a low-tax government. It was a relatively high-tax, high-service government. They got into the spirit of saying, we are rebuilding this province. Better schools, build power systems, building natural gas systems, building hospitals and medical care systems. We know it's going to cost us money, but we're prepared to pay.
Tommy Douglas was elected to 5 terms over the next 18 years. He was renowned for the urgency he brought to his administration.
And he wanted the hospital insurance plan mounted, and he wanted it done by January 1st, 1947. And his staff told him, I'm sorry, we simply can't get this program ready to go. And Tommy's reputed to have said to them, he was really sorry to hear that they couldn't get it mounted by January 1st. He really enjoyed working with them, but now he'd have to get another team because it had to get going by January 1st. His preferred time for getting things done was yesterday, and by tomorrow he was wondering why it wasn't done.
By the late 1950s, the Douglas government had introduced paved roads, sewage systems, rural electrification, car insurance, and labor reforms. SaskPower had been created, and by 1964, 65,000 farms were hooked up to the electrical grid. SaskTel provided affordable, universal phone access. In 1959, Douglas announced the Medicare plan. It would be universal, prepaid, and publicly administered. 2 years later, Tommy Douglas returned to national politics.
There was no question that Tommy was the choice of people right across Canada because of what he'd done in Saskatchewan. He was their choice for leader. They were just introducing the Medicare legislation in Saskatchewan. The medical profession at that time and many other groups in Saskatchewan were very much opposed to it, were doing everything they could to try and prevent it from coming into being. So Tommy then had a very difficult transition to the federal leadership.
The NDP's first election was a disappointment. They won only 19 seats, and Douglas suffered the indignity of losing his cherished Regina seat.
Tommy, I think, showed his real leadership skills at that time. And he quoted a famous Scot by the name of Sir Andrew Barton when he told the crowd who'd assembled that night He said, "Take cheer, me lads. I am wounded, but I am not slain. I'll lay me down and bleed a while, then rise and fight again."
Douglas continued as leader of the NDP through the 1960s. During this time, the ruling Liberal Party adopted both universal Medicare and an old age pension plan. Both had long been a part of Tommy Douglas's platform. In October 1970, Douglas took a controversial stand by voting against the War Measures Act.
At the time of the FLQ crisis in Quebec, when there'd been two people who'd been taken prisoner, and one was killed eventually. The federal Liberal government reacted in a panic in many ways, and they proclaimed the War Measures Act. Tommy Douglas argued at that time that that was not an appropriate measure. It was not the right thing to do.
Douglas resigned as leader of the NDP in 1971, but retained his seat in Parliament until he retired in 1979.
He got things done, and he inspired people to do their best as public servants, as politicians, and as citizens. We in Saskatchewan and we in Canada owe him a great debt.
Presently there came along one little mouse who had an idea. And he said to the other mice, "Look, fellas, why do we keep on electing a government made up of cats? Why don't we elect a government made up of mice?" Oh, he said, "He's a Bolshevik. Lock him up." But I want to remind you that you can lock up a mouse or a man, but you can't lock up an idea.
The words can sometimes be heard in the wake of